David Carrington had it all: the mansion, the empire, the wife who had stood by him through every storm. But one day, when the mirrors began showing him lines he could not ignore, he decided loyalty was boring, and youth was everything. He left Laura, his partner of 20 years, for a woman half her age, thinking he had upgraded his life. He flaunted his new love, basking in the attention, certain he had won. But fate has a memory longer than arrogance can see. Years later, in a sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital room, David sat helpless. 4 newborns cried around him, tiny hands flailing, their needs overwhelming. Brittany, the young woman he had risked everything for, was nowhere to be found, and in that cold, echoing room, as the reality of what he had lost weighed heavy on his chest, David finally realized, karma never forgets. Laura Bennett was never the kind of woman who needed attention. She did not wear glittering jewels. She did not parade herself on social media. Her beauty was quieter, deeper, the kind that revealed itself in patience, in kindness, in the soft strength only life's hardest lessons could forge. She met David Carrington when neither of them had anything, not a dime to spare, not a promise of tomorrow, just dreams. And long nights spent building something brick by brick. Laura worked 2 jobs when David's startup struggled. She paid the bills when investments fell through. She stayed up past midnight organizing documents, coding websites, supporting him in every silent way. Success demands, but rarely thanks. When the money finally came, it came like a flood. Suddenly, there were penthouses, sports cars, invitations to charity galas where Laura often felt invisible, standing next to socialites in glittering gowns. Still, she never complained. She believed love was about loyalty, about standing with someone even when their head turned toward bigger, shinier things. Friends often told Laura she was too humble, but Laura knew where real power lived. It was not in gold-plated lobbies. It was not in luxury yachts. It was in keeping your soul soft, even when the world tried to harden you. Yet, slowly, she began to notice changes. David stopped looking at her during dinners. He stopped laughing at her silly jokes the way he used to. The late-night business trips grew longer. The excuses grew thinner. And Laura's heart, so faithful, so full, began to sense what the mind was still too loyal to admit. Something was breaking, something precious. But she held on, because that is what loyal hearts do. They hold on until the other person lets go. And when David finally let go, he did it without hesitation, without mercy, without looking back. Laura stood quietly on the steps of their mansion as he drove away with a woman young enough to be his daughter. Her hands trembled, her heart ached, but her dignity never left her, because real worth, she knew, was never determined by who walked out. It was proven by who stood tall when everything else fell apart. It happened on an evening that began like any other. Laura had spent the afternoon arranging a surprise dinner for David. Homemade pasta, his favorite dessert, candles flickering gently against the soft music playing in the background. She wore the dress he once said made her look like the first sunrise he had ever seen. She waited and waited. Finally, the sound of keys rattling at the door made her heart lift. David entered dressed sharply, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and late-night meetings, but there was something different, something colder. He barely looked at the table she had so lovingly set. He barely glanced at her. Instead, he loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and without sitting down, without even softening his voice, he said the words that would break her world apart. "Laura, I have been thinking I need something different. I need someone who makes me feel alive again." The words hit like fists. She stood there, frozen, a nervous laugh slipping from her lips. Sure, it was a bad joke. But David was not laughing. He emptied his glass and added almost casually, "Brittany understands me. She is vibrant. She reminds me who I used to be. Laura felt the room spin, the candles blurred. The warmth of the home she had built with love and sacrifice now felt like a stranger's house. She opened her mouth, desperate for air, desperate for anything that could stop this unraveling. But David was already walking away, already texting someone, already leaving behind the woman who had stitched his dreams together while he slept. Within a week, he filed for divorce. Within 2 weeks, he had moved into a new penthouse with Brittany, young, dazzling, ready for the cameras. Friends called Laura with hollow apologies. Newspapers printed cruel headlines. Tech mogul Carrington's fresh start, new love, new life. There was no fresh start for Laura. Only a house full of memories she had to pack into boxes. Only empty chairs at a dinner table, once filled with laughter. Only the hollow echo of promises broken without a second thought. And yet, Laura did not beg. She did not scream. She signed the papers. She walked out with nothing but her dignity intact. Because she knew something David had forgotten. Gold may glitter, but it is loyalty that shines when the lights go out. And one day, the lights would go out. For him. And when they did, Laura would already be walking in a brighter world he could never enter again. At first, it seemed like David Carrington had won. Photos of him and Brittany flooded the society pages. Yacht parties, red carpets, exotic vacations. His smile beamed through every lens, every headline screaming about his second youth. Laura stayed away from the noise. She moved into a modest apartment near a small garden she loved. She picked up old hobbies, painting, volunteering, reading novels she never had time for during the chaos of building an empire. But David's empire, like all things built on vanity, began to show its cracks. It started quietly. Brittany's credit card bills began arriving. Numbers. So absurd, even David's CFO raised an eyebrow. Private jets, designer handbags. Nights at exclusive clubs. Every conversation between them seemed to end with Brittany sighing dramatically, demanding more excitement, more adventure, more. At first, David brushed it off. He was the powerful one, after all, the provider, the man who could buy happiness with a signature. But happiness, as he would soon learn, was a currency far rarer than money could buy. The tension grew when Brittany announced she was pregnant. David plastered on his public smile, nodding at reporters, who shouted questions about his growing family. Behind closed doors, however, fear gnawed at him. He was not young anymore. Late-night parties suddenly felt exhausting instead of thrilling. Endless shopping sprees began bleeding into board meetings. The very youth he had clung to so desperately now felt like a weight chained to his chest. Still, he tried to keep up appearances. Still, he told himself he was in control, until the doctor's appointment that changed everything. Sitting in the cold ultrasound room, Brittany chewing gum noisily beside him, David stared at the monitor. The technician smiled awkwardly. "Congratulations," she said. "You are not having one baby, you are having 4. Quadruplets." The room tilted around him. 4 cribs, 4 college funds, 4 futures racing toward him at once, and he could barely manage the life he had now. Brittany squealed with delight, already pulling out her phone to schedule interviews and sponsorship deals. David sat frozen, the first real seed of panic blooming in his chest. This was not the life he had imagined when he traded loyalty for lust. This was not the second youth he had dreamed of. This was chaos. And it was only just beginning. Meanwhile, across town, Laura watered her garden, smiling softly, living simply, building a new life with roots too deep for any storm to touch. Because real strength is not built in flashes of attention. It is grown slowly, patiently, in the quiet places others forget to look. The months that followed blurred into a nightmare David Carrington could not wake up from. At first, he told himself he could handle it. He had built billion-dollar companies. After all, he could surely manage a few babies. But reality was not a quarterly report. It screamed at 2 in the morning. It cried in 4 different voices at once. It drained every ounce of patience, energy, and pride he thought he had left. Brittany, once the dazzling life of every party, vanished quickly into resentment. She hated the stretch marks. She hated the ruined figure. She hated the endless responsibility no nanny could fully carry. Within 3 months, Brittany filed for divorce. Cold, sharp, demanding full custody, child support, and a massive settlement. David stared at the papers, the words blurring in front of his tired eyes. It had been a business transaction for her all along. And now, she wanted her final payout, but the nightmare was only beginning. As the court battles raged, David's company's stock plummeted. The headlines he once craved now bled his reputation dry. Carrington's collapse, from tech titan to tabloids. Billionaire playboy faces multi-million-dollar custody battle. Investors pulled back, partnerships dissolved. He tried to hide the truth, but the media devoured him whole. And through it all, the real storm raged at home. The quadruplets, innocent and unaware, needed more than money. They needed patience, love, stability, things David no longer had the energy or the heart to provide. Late one night, sitting alone in a dark hospital room after one of the infants developed complications, David stared out the rain-speckled window. For the first time, he admitted the truth. He was not the man he thought he was. He was not the hero of his story. He was the architect of his own downfall, and the face that flashed unbidden in his mind was not Brittany's. It was Laura's, her gentle smile, her quiet strength, her steady hand when life felt too heavy to carry alone. He had traded gold for glitter, love for lust, loyalty for vanity, and now he sat surrounded by riches he could no longer touch and burdens he had no one left to share. The realization was not loud. It was a cold, whispering silence that wrapped around him and would not let. Gokama had not screamed its arrival. It had simply waited, patiently, until David opened the door himself. And now, it was sitting across from him, cradling 4 tiny reminders that some lessons cost everything. As David sat in that dim hospital room, the soft hum of machines filling the silence, pieces of his past began to drift back like ghosts, memories he had pushed aside, moments he had forgotten or pretended to forget. Long before the fame, before the billions, there had been a young man struggling to pay his college tuition, working night shifts at a gas station just to afford textbooks. It was Laura who had walked into his life when he had nothing. Laura who had stayed up with him during sleepless nights, quizzing him for exams, bringing him coffee in chipped mugs, never once asking for anything in return. When his first company collapsed, Laura had not left. She had sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering the words he could not believe. "We will build it again." When he could not afford to take her out on fancy dates, she packed picnic lunches and said she preferred the stars anyway. Laura had been there not for what he had, but for who he was. And now, looking around at the sterile walls, the empty chair, across from him, and the 4 tiny infants he barely knew how to comfort, David finally understood the depth of what he had lost. It was never about youth. It was never about beauty. It was about loyalty. It was about a love that showed up when life was hard, when the cameras were off, when the world had nothing to offer but struggle, and he had thrown it all away for a sparkle that faded the moment the party ended. David thought back to the last real conversation he had with Laura during the divorce. No shouting, no begging, just her calm, heartbreaking words. "I loved you when you had nothing. I would have loved you through anything, but I will not love someone who forgets what loyalty means." At the time, he had brushed it off. He had been too busy chasing a mirage. Now, sitting under the flickering fluorescent lights, he felt the full weight of those words pressing down on his chest, heavier than any fortune he had ever amassed. It was not Laura who had lost. It was him. It had always been him. He had traded a heart that would have weathered any storm for a season that ended before he even realized it had begun. And now, karma had returned, not with revenge, but with revelation. And revelation, David realized too late, is sometimes the heaviest burden of all. As David's world crumbled, Laura's life bloomed in ways she could never have imagined. At first, after the divorce, she had been lost, wandering empty rooms, sorting through old memories packed in brown boxes, asking herself in the stillness of long nights, "Who am I without him?" But slowly, in the quiet, she remembered she was never someone because of David. She had always been someone because of the woman she chose to be. She took the modest settlement she received and made it stretch, not into luxury, but into possibility. Laura opened a small bookstore and cafe in her new neighborhood, a cozy place filled with warmth, where no one cared about the brand of your shoes or the weight of your wallet. Local artists displayed their work on the walls. Children curled up with storybooks in corners. Neighbors gathered for coffee and laughter. It was not the kind of place that made headlines, but it was the kind of place that made hearts feel at home. Laura's business grew, slowly and steadily, not because she spent millions on marketing, but because kindness does not need advertising. Word of mouth traveled farther than any glossy magazine could have. People loved the little sanctuary she had built, and in loving it, they loved her. Meanwhile, David fought endless court battles, trying to keep up with child support payments that drained his accounts faster than any yacht or private jet ever had. Investors stopped taking his calls. The glossy magazines that once celebrated his every move now featured newer, younger billionaires on their covers. He became a relic of a time that passed him by, forgotten by the very world he had sacrificed everything to impress. Late one night, scrolling mindlessly through his news feed, David stumbled across an article. Local. Hero, how Laura Bennett built a business that feels like home. There she was, smiling, surrounded by families, books, and laughter. There were no luxury cars, no flashing jewelry, no desperate need to be seen. She was simply shining, not because the world had finally noticed her worth, but because she had never needed their permission to have it. David stared at her photo for a long time. He tried to remember the last time he had seen her smile like that. He could not, because by the time she found her light again, he was already sitting in the dark, and he would stay there, because some doors, once slammed shut by betrayal, never open again. Guilt is a slow poison. At first, David Carrington thought he could outrun it. He threw himself into work, what little remained of it. He spent weekends planning lavish gifts for the children he barely knew how to comfort. He told himself he would rebuild, reclaim the image he had so carefully crafted. But guilt is patient, and it always demands to be felt. Late one evening, after settling the quadruplets with tired hands and an aching back, David found himself scrolling through old contacts, searching for something, someone who could lift the crushing loneliness from his chest. His fingers hovered over a name, Laura. For a long time he stared at it. Memories flooded back, of laughter echoing in small apartments, of Laura's steady hands binding his broken dreams together when no one else cared. He pressed call before he could think. The phone rang once, twice, and then her voice, not live, just a voicemail. "Hello, you have reached Laura Bennett. Thank you for calling. Please leave a message and remember, kindness is free." Her voice was soft, unchanged. Pain tightened David's throat. When the beep came, he stumbled over his words. "Laura, I..." Just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I was a fool. I see that now. I miss who I was when I was with you. He ended the call before he could embarrass himself further. A part of him, the foolish part that had once believed he could buy anything, thought maybe she would call back. Maybe forgiveness was just a conversation away. But the days turned into weeks. No call came, no letter, no second chance, because some things once broken, trust, dignity, love, do not heal with apologies whispered into empty phone lines. Laura had moved on. She had built a world that did not include the man who forgot her worth until it was too late. And David, he was left holding the pieces of a life he had smashed with his own hands. The boutique suits no longer fit. The luxury cars gathered dust. The world that once cheered for him had long moved on to newer, brighter distractions. And somewhere, not too far away, a woman he once took for granted was living her life full of light, laughter, and love without him. Because karma's harshest lesson is not punishment. It is watching someone thrive in a world where your absence makes it better. The world had moved fast, faster than David Carrington could catch up. Once the darling of tech magazines and business award shows, David now found his name attached to very different headlines. Former billionaire battles custody and financial collapse. From boardrooms to diapers, the fall of David Carrington. And just beneath those headlines, quietly but steadily, another story grew, Laura's story. Her bookstore cafe, once a humble neighborhood project, had blossomed into a symbol of resilience, a symbol of rebuilding, a symbol of true strength. National magazines picked up her story. Woman rebuilds life after billionaire divorce and inspires a community. Talk shows invited her to speak, not about revenge, not about the scandal, but about hope, about kindness, about standing tall after heartbreak. Everywhere she went, people lined up, not to see a celebrity, but to thank her, to hug her, to tell her how her quiet dignity had helped them find their own. Laura never spoke David's name. She never needed to. Her story was not about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been discarded, every heart that had ever been broken, every soul that had ever been told they were replaceable and proved otherwise. At charity events, children she had helped through her new literacy foundation ran to greet her, wrapping their arms around her waist, showing her the kind of love money could never buy. At every book signing, strangers thanked her for being a light in a world that sometimes worshipped the wrong heroes. David saw it all. He watched from behind screens, from lonely offices, from empty rooms. He saw Laura glowing in a way she never had when she was with him, because now she was free to be fully herself. He realized then something more devastating than losing his fortune, more painful than late night. Cries from 4 tiny cribs. Laura's heart had healed in places he could no longer reach. The public saw it too. They celebrated her. They forgot him. He had once believed he could write his own legend. But legends, he now understood, are not built by those who chase glory. They are built by those who carry themselves with grace when the world is at its cruelest. And Laura had become a legend in a way David never could, because dignity, once tested and proven, becomes unstoppable. And David, he was simply the footnote in a story that would be remembered for everything he was not. Redemption did not come through court rulings. Justice did not arrive with flashing cameras or screaming headlines. It came quietly. It came in the way Laura smiled without bitterness. It came in the way her bookstore expanded to a second, then a third location. Places that became community anchors, filled with stories, warmth, and second chances. It came in the way people spoke her name, with respect, with admiration, with hope. Laura's foundation for single parents grew as well, offering grants, education, and free childcare to those trying to rebuild their lives after betrayal and hardship. She had turned her private pain into a public movement. Not because she needed applause, but because she understood that true healing was not just surviving what broke you, it was using it to build something better for others. Meanwhile, David Carrington's empire was no more. The once mighty Carrington Tech was sold off in pieces to competitors he once mocked. The penthouse, the sports cars, the designer suits, all auctioned quietly to pay mounting legal and personal debts. He spent his days shuffling between court hearings and cold boardrooms that no longer welcomed his shadow, and every night, as the quadruplets he once thought would complete his fantasy cried out for comfort he could barely provide, David lay awake, staring into the darkness he had created. He was not hated. He was not loved. He was forgotten. That was Karma's final, silent victory. And Laura, on a bright spring morning, she stood before a crowd at the ribbon-cutting ceremony of her latest bookstore and community center. Children held colorful balloons. Families laughed and hugged. Reporters snapped pictures. But Laura ignored the flashes. She was too busy watching the sunlight dance across the smiling faces around her, too busy living a life rooted in kindness, loyalty, and quiet strength. When asked how she built so much after losing so much, Laura smiled gently and said, "You cannot control how people treat you, but you can always choose who you become because of it." And with that, she cut the ribbon, not just on a new building, but on a future she had crafted with her own hands. A future David Carrington could never touch, because real success is not having more, it is becoming more, and Laura Bennett had become unstoppable. On a quiet Sunday morning, Laura sat alone on a wooden bench outside her bookstore. The sun had just risen, casting soft gold across the sleepy town. Birds chirped in the distance. The air smelled of fresh coffee and blooming jasmine. In her lap, she held a worn-out journal, the same journal she had kept during those dark days after David left. Pages filled with pain, pages filled with prayers, pages filled with dreams she never dared say aloud. She flipped through them slowly, smiling at the girl she once was, the one who thought her world had ended when love betrayed her. She realized now that it had not ended. It had begun. The woman she had become, the leader, the builder, the inspiration, was born from the ashes of heartbreak, and she would not trade any part of the journey, even the painful parts, because they had carved strength into her soul. Nearby, children laughed as they tumbled out of the bookstore. Doors, their arms full of books and hope. Parents waved, friends gathered, neighbors smiled. Laura watched them all, her heart full not of bitterness, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons. Gratitude for the second chances, gratitude for the quiet power that had carried her when the world turned cold. She closed the journal gently and placed it beside her. Then she stood up, brushed a loose strand of hair from her face and walked back toward the life she had built, not in spite of what had happened to her, but because she chose to rise after it. No cameras, no fanfare, just a woman who had rediscovered herself when the world expected her to disappear. And as the sun climbed higher into the sky, Laura smiled, not because life was perfect, but because she was perfectly herself, unbreakable, unstoppable, and forever free. The world often measures success by who shouts the loudest, by who has the flashiest life, by who seems to win the fastest. But Laura's story reminds us, real success is quiet. It is built in lonely nights when you refuse to give up. It is stitched into the way you carry yourself when no one is watching. It is born not from revenge, but from resilience. Betrayal does not define you. Failure does not finish you. Pain does not own you. What defines you is what you do next. Laura could have crumbled, she could have chased revenge, she could have stayed broken, but she chose to rise, she chose to rebuild, she chose to let the storms carve strength into her bones instead of bitterness into her heart, and in doing so, She proved a truth that every soul needs to hear. They can take everything from you, except your choice to begin again. So when life tries to break you, when betrayal knocks the breath from your chest, when the world turns its back on your loyalty, remember, Laura, remember that the best revenge is not hatred. It is happiness. It is building a life so beautiful, so free, so full of peace, that those who doubted you are left standing in the ruins of their own choices. If you believe that true strength is rising after betrayal, comment below, "I choose to rise." Like this video to spread Laura's powerful story, and subscribe for more real-life stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of the unstoppable power within.